This video is about bookkeeping entries. I will talk about the double entry system. The video is linked to the chapter 12 of the textbook. I'm Carsten Berkau, full accounting professor in Osnabrück. My basics clips will help you to understand international bookkeeping. For the case study PELZERHAGEN, we will have only a few items. Next, I want to draw a kind of journal. So I write debit entries and credit entries. With regard to the expenses, I only record the debit side, and with regard to the revenue, I only record the credit side. In order to record our bookkeeping entries, we can draw tier accounts for each and every item. There will be special accounts like asset accounts. This will be here in our case property, plant and equipment and cash bank. On the other side of the balance sheet we get capital accounts which are linked to the equity, and we got liabilities account. The difference between asset accounts and liabilities account is that the asset account will increase always on the debit side, whereas capital or equity and liability accounts increase on the credit side. Expenses are always recorded on the debit side. Revenue is always recorded on the credit side. In accounting, there are two principles which will be relevant for our bookkeeping entries. The first one is the accounting equation. The accounting equation says assets is the same as liabilities and capital. This means that the total on the left-hand side of the balance sheet is the total on the right-hand side of the balance sheet. The other one is a double entry system. In order to fulfill the accounting equation at any time, we always have to make debit and credit entries. If there is one bookkeeping entry that has more than one debit entry, then the total of the debit entries per bookkeeping entry have to be the total of the credit entries of the bookkeeping entry. To study these two principles, we now discuss the case study PELZERHAGEN Limited. After every bookkeeping entry, I will prepare a balance sheet in order to check whether the accounting equation is still fulfilled. You won't do this in the accounting work, but for this video, I just want to prove that the accounting equation is fulfilled as long as we follow the double entry system. For this case study, the bookkeeping entries are in chapter 12, but the story about PELZERHAGEN Limited is described in chapter 11. The bookkeeping entry for rent are shown here. As you can see, there's always a debit entry and a credit entry, and the amount is the same. The same applies for the salaries, for the acquisition, for depreciation. So you see always there is a debit entry and then we make a credit entry. I marked the totals on the asset side and on the credit side by a yellow color. Whenever we make a bookkeeping entry, just check whether the totals are still the same. Now I will record the bookkeeping entries. Bookkeeping entry 0 is about the establishment of the business. I make a debit entry in cash bank and a credit entry in the issued capital. I make a debit entry in the asset account, cash bank, and I record a credit entry in share capital. The next bookkeeping entry is for rent. We make a debit entry in the rent account, which is an expense account, and we credit cash bank. For rent, I make a debit entry in the retained earnings account. As retained earnings is on the credit side, I have to record it as a negative figure to the extent of 3,400. And I deduct on the asset side 3,400 as well. We record labor by making a debit entry in the labor account, which is an expense account, and we credit cash bank. Bookkeeping entry 2 is a debit entry in the retained earnings account. I deduct 48,000, and it is a credit entry in cash bank. With bookkeeping entry 3 alpha, we record the acquisition. It gives us a debit entry in property, plant and equipment, and we credit the accounts payables account as the payment is agreed to take place later. So I make bookkeeping entry 2 alpha on the debit side of the property, plant and equipment account, and I make a credit entry in the accounts payables account. The acquisition is a debit entry in property, plant and equipment, and as the equipment is not paid directly, we make a credit entry in accounts payables. After the acquisition, we record the depreciation. For the depreciation, we apply a simplified bookkeeping entry, as depreciation is only covered in the textbook in chapter 16. For that reason, in chapter 12, where we are right now, the bookkeeping entry would be a debit entry in the depreciation account, and the credit entry is recorded in property, plant and equipment. Later, we will replace that credit entry by the accumulated depreciation account. I make a bookkeeping entry on the debit side for the expense and on the credit side in property, plant and equipment. Depreciation is an expense. We record negative 10,000 because it is a debit entry, and we reduce property, plant and equipment. Bookkeeping entry 4 is about the revenue recognition. We make a debit entry in an asset account, cash bank, and we make a credit entry in revenue. The revenue recognition gives us a debit entry in cash bank, so we add 130,000, and we add on the credit side 130,000 as well in the revenue account, which is represented by retained earnings. After this bookkeeping entry made, we will be able to calculate the pre-tax profit. We multiply the pre-tax profit with the income tax rate, which is in our case study 30%, and then we deduct the income taxes as an expense from the retained earnings account, and we add them to the income tax liabilities account. We make a debit entry in the income tax expense account, and we record a credit entry in the income tax liabilities account. In the retained earnings account, you later find the profit after taxes. With the next bookkeeping entry, we deduct the income tax liabilities from retained earnings and we add them to the income tax liabilities. Debit entry 20,580 in the retained earnings account. Credit entry is in the income tax liabilities account. We check the accounting equation and we acknowledge the total on the asset side is the same as the total on the capital and liability side. So the accounting equation is fulfilled. Now that you have seen the video, take the textbook and study the case.